Thanks, Dominic. So to talk about Trollope, I actually went back to a short series of blog posts I wrote about 6 years ago about books that changed my life, one of which was The Warden. And I went back and reread it, and actually I don't think I'd change any of it. So I'd like to share some, in the interest of time, some edited highlights from that blog, which I hope you'll find interesting. So it's the mid-1990s, and we're waiting for a bus. My wife dives into the Oxfam bookshop to see what they have. And she emerges a few minutes later with a copy of The Warden. And she says, they had this, and we don't have any Trollope, and I thought you might like it. And that turned out to be one of the greatest understatements she's made in our marriage, because I read the novel over the next couple of days. It set me off reading marathon of Trollope that's lasted until now. And it's a great journey, as you all know, with fascinating characters and a warm, humane guide. And much though I love many Trollope novels, I do come back to The Warden. And in my blog post, I summarise the plot of The Warden, which obviously don't need to do for this audience. But thinking about the plot of The Warden, it's at one level a fairly trivial aspect of the social upheavals taking place in Victorian Britain. But it's also a bit of a microcosm of a battle between what the Victorians would probably have called tradition and reform, the forces of change and the forces of stability and continuity. And as you all know, Trollope was extremely ambivalent about these two forces. He stood as a liberal. Instinctively, he's kind of on the side of reform, but he also regrets some of the things that are passing, and some of the passages he writes in The Warden about the cathedral and how he feels about the church very much bring that out. And I feel that that tension between tradition and reform is one of the things that makes the novel very relevant to us today. You can read it as a depiction of a pivotal point in history, and it's very interesting as such, but it's far more than that, because from the 21st century, we can see that in those terms, reform won comprehensively out over tradition, and the forces of rationality and the free market and mechanization progressively undermined and demolished traditions and the emotional attachments that go with them. And the Church of England has moved ever closer towards collapse, and Parliament has never been held in lower esteem. And in some respects, many of us would see this, at least in part, as a good thing, and we wouldn't necessarily want to return to the deference and the inherited privilege of the past. But there is this question about what's being destroyed in the process, because individual freedom is a good thing, but if we weaken institutions too far, then can society hold together? And that's a tension that's only become more obvious in recent years. And the church may no longer be fit for purpose, perhaps, but do we have anything to replace its moral vision other than more and more consumption? We shouldn't have politicians telling us what's good for us, but if we have government by focus group, then do we just avoid tough decisions? And these questions don't have easy answers, any more than Mr. Harding's dilemma in the novel has easy answers. And of course, as you know, he ultimately follows his conscience by abandoning the hospital and all the people that he's looked after so diligently. But the legal issues around his resignation don't allow for a replacement. And in many ways, this is a very unsatisfactory solution all round, as is the case with so many disputes. But I think what Trollope is suggesting, perhaps in his understated way, is that maybe the situation would have been better handled if all the people involved had actually approached it with humility and with open-mindedness and with a willingness to think the best of each other rather than the worst of each other. And if what would have happened if they'd actually tried to seek a sustainable solution to this issue rather than just win the battle. So as we think about, the modern political situation, environmental damage, financial crisis, perhaps it's becoming obvious that progress is not necessarily an unmitigated good. And if we're going to manage all of this to perhaps create a better world, then what we need is the warmth, the humanity, the balance, the thoughtfulness of people like Trollope and maybe even Mr. Harding, perhaps now more than ever. Thank you, that's my thoughts.